First talk to you about the trail that you're going to be walking on. It's known as today as the Minquas Trail, named for the Minquas Indians. It's the earliest road of commerce in Pennsylvania because it was used by the Dutch and the Swedes to take trade goods out to the Susquehannock Indians and bring furs, like George said, back. And this is a beaver pelt here. They would have brought tens of thousands of those back with them. And deer skins and any other kind of skins, coyotes and any other kind of fur. But the road, it was a road of commerce, and it probably obviously predates the Europeans as a trail, an Indian trail. And in later years, it became the road west. The earliest settled areas of Lancaster County around the Hans House are on Penn Grant Road, which is basically the Minquas Trail. And there's actually a marker there that says this is the earliest settled area of Lancaster County. And they would have come by way of this road. So, and also there were Indian treaties and Indian conferences. Sometimes the Indians would come to Philadelphia or to the Swedish or Dutch settlements. Other times the dignitaries would go to them at their Indian towns. Twice William Penn went out in the 1680s and early 1700s to conferences. So just think about this when you're walking the trail, that you're walking in William Penn's footsteps. You actually are walking in his footsteps. And in one of the earlier governors, Governor Gordon, he would come out to different governors and different dignitaries. I can't remember their names now, but a lot of them you'd probably remember or know if I remembered their names that walked to this trail. Now, when they went out to trade or to do a conference, they didn't just go out with a couple people. Like William Penn didn't go out by himself. He would have had an entourage. Same thing with the traders, because the traders traded tons of goods, from heavy cast iron pots to heavy axe heads to everything you can think of. They had an entourage of probably 20, 30 people, plus pack animals like horses or oxen, would go out with a big, parade of people and goods to go out there. They were licensed. They had to be licensed by the government, the local government at the time, and they would have eventually, when they became known to the Indians and had worked it out with the Indians, they would have a log cabin set up, which would be their trading post. When the Indians went east, especially the Swedish and Dutch days, they would trade at like Fort Manioc or Fort Beaversreed, which were the Dutch and Swedish forts on the Schuylkill River. One of the earliest trading posts was set up by Jonas Nielsen. It was off of Island Avenue down by the International Airport on a creek called Mingo Creek, which is now under about 50 foot of river dredging fill, all to the left of Island Avenue as you're going to the airport. That wasteland down there used to be beautiful valleys and trees, and he came over as a soldier to guard the fort at Tinicum, the fort at Tinicum, the Governor Prince built. And when his tour of duty was over, rather than going back to Sweden, he decided to get a license and trade to the Indians, and he built this trading post on the Minquas Trail, which went through that area. So he's probably one of the earliest licensed traders. Later, there were other traders in the 17 and 1800s, or in 1600s, that would go west. Like when I say west, like to Downingtown or the other side of Delaware County. As the frontier moved west, at one point, when I'm involved with the Swedish Cabin, as George is, when that was built in the 1650s, where we're standing was unknown territory. This was the frontier. So as Europeans came over and settled, the frontier kept moving until we finally hit the Pacific Ocean in the 19th century. But so as that happened, the traders would move west with the Indians. Like by the 18th century, most of the trading was going on out in Pittsburgh area, in western Pennsylvania and Ohio. But in our earlier century, it was the Susquehanna River. And as George said, there were two main tribes in the area, the Lenni Lenape, who lived in this area, who were divided into three clans: the turtle, the fox, and the turkey. The turtle, the wolf, and the turkey, I'm sorry. And the one clan was in New Jersey area, another clan was in this part of Pennsylvania, and the other clan was up near Muncie, up the Delaware River above Trenton, up towards like Matamoras, up in that area. They were the Lenni Lenape, who later became known as the Delaware Indians, named for the Delaware River, which was named for Lord De La Warr, who was an early explorer. The Susquehannocks on the Susquehanna River eventually were annihilated and disappeared from history they were renamed the Conestoga Indians because by the 18th century they had shrunk down to a few hundred who lived in a town called the Conestoga town, which is where a lot of the treaties that William Penn went to was. By the French Indian War, they had dwindled down to just a few, and a lot of them were massacred by the Paxton Boys in the 1760s, what was left of them. So the other reason they kind of dwindled down from thousands when John Smith first discovered them in the early 1600s was they were a warlike tribe, as George said, mostly feared by other Indians, always trying to outdo other Indians by taking their territory and killing them and putting them under their jurisdiction, you might say. But because of all this warlike atmosphere that they had for their whole existence, and Europeans bringing diseases over, they were dwindled down to next to nothing until they disappeared. Whereas the Lenape, who weren't as warlike, are still in existing as the Delaware Indians living in Oklahoma. They still are around. A lot of Indian tribes from the 17th and 18th century and earlier ended up being eradicated by other tribes until they don't exist anymore. I mean, that whole branch of Indian tribes don't exist anymore. It's one of the things they did in the wars. Just like Europeans, they not only just killed the other warriors, they killed women and children too. They tried to eradicate the whole. I mean, doing that is nothing new in history. It was actually worse back then than it is today. I mean, it's still going on in the 21st century. So what you see here is, I'll try to make this short because I'm going to get hollered at if time for you guys to leave. These are some items that were traded to the Indians of the tons of stuff that was taken out there. I mean, everything that the European had, from clothing to shoes to blankets to coats to cooking kettles and utensils, big heavy cast iron kettles, glass bottles, the copper and the brass. Down there I have a brass kettle, and they had big kettles. They weren't, and big bottles and big pots. To ironware such as axes and hammers and saws and then clay pipes, and the colorful things here are called trade beads. They were made in Italy and Venice. Venice specialized in making trade beads specifically to be traded to American Indians or Africans in Africa, because they were trading to Africa at the same time as they were trading over here. And the Indians loved these colorful, fancy beads. They were traded like 4 L's for a certain skin, and an L was from the tip of your fingers to your elbow. So they'd come in long strands and they'd measure them that way, like 4 of them would be 4 times. And they basically had price lists, like a small beaver like that might be worth, I don't know, say 5 L's of beads if you were trading for beads. And of course knives, they loved their knives. The Indian was in the Stone Age until that point with their introduction to Europeans. And this is called a hammerstone. It was prehistoric, found on a farm near Honeybrook. You can actually see where it was used to strike things. And it fits nicely in your palm, but that's the kind of things they used with stone. They had stone axes. This is a small axe head, prehistoric. But then they went from that to these kinds of axes. And these are exciting because these were actually dug at a Susquehannock site about 50 years ago, known as the Strickler site. And they're Dutch or Swedish. They were brought out there by, this one has a little stamp on it. And they were traded to the Susquehannocks. But in order to get there, these items came right out this trail. This thing was on this trail 400 years ago, heading probably on the back of an oxen heading west. And here it is again today, right where it was 400 years ago, which is kind of exciting.
Made of iron?
Yeah, they're iron. Made in Europe. This stamp, which is a cross, I lost it. Sun moved. I can't see it now.
I think it's right there.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
This stamp, they had guilds in Europe, and when they made things, they had a specialized stamp they had to stamp their things with to prove that they were a member of the guild. And there's actually books out that show these different kinds of stamps that they had for these trade axes. And there were companies or men and companies in Europe and in Canada that specifically made things just to trade to the Indians. That was the whole business. Because what you had was, you had trade companies that were the sponsors of these traders, that were like investors, you might say. Matter of fact, a lot of our early settlements, like Jamestown and Plymouth and the Swedes and the Dutch, they didn't just come over to farm. They came over because they were sponsored by a trade company who basically wanted money. They wanted profits. And the profits and the money were from furs. And of course in Virginia sometimes after the furs it was tobacco. But they wanted money back. One of the things in New England that they shipped back to England to make profit was for ship masts. They were the tall pine trees. And they would ship them by the shipload back. They would cut them down and strip them of their bark and everything and ship them back for masts for tall ships. So none of this was done just out of a whim. It was done for a reason. Usually the traders didn't have the money to buy all this stuff. It was sponsored to them by their sponsors or their investors. And then they would come back. They would make money too, but they would come back and bring the skins back, get paid there for their services, and then the investors would then ship them over to England or Europe and then make their money. It was all about money. It was all about the Benjamins.